Okay, here we are. We're ready to start. I believe this is week 12. I believe we have 2 more weeks to go. When we finish tonight, we'll have 2 more weeks to go. I usually put the weeks on our sheet, but I haven't done that. Tonight, we're really going to look at King Roger II of Italy, of Sicily and Italy, and we're going to look at a rival empire to the more famous one in England, and we'll try to look at how Roger puts that empire together and how he begins to build a bureaucratic structure. And it really, his achievement, I think, is far more remarkable than that of William the Conqueror in England, because when he started in Italy and Sicily, well, to begin with, it was never unified, and there was never any conception of unifying it, and he was really the first to think of it as an empire and to actually pull it together. This is an enormous achievement and very remarkable. Our assigned book for this section, looking at the empire, is Roger II of Sicily, A Ruler Between East and West, by Hubert Hoban. And this is quite a marvelous book. I really like it. How do you all like it? How many of you? Go ahead.
It seems like he goes back and forth a lot with the timelines. And this is a lot easier to read, even though it's a translation.
Yeah, and you like this a lot better than Loud's book. This is such a difficult period, you know, because so few people have written in English about it, and even this is a German book that's been translated into English, but I thought it was quite a fine book. I really enjoyed it. Any other comments on this book for the rest of you? What do you think of this book? Have you read it?
It's a pleasant change from the other ones.
Okay, it's a pleasant change from the other one. That's very good. I'm glad you found it quite readable, and it's more limited, I think, in scope. Part of the problem is the subject matter. With Robert Guiscard, the Normans are flying all over the place, and so is Robert Guiscard, and there are so many loose ends to tie together, but this is more unified right on Roger. Yeah, comment.
And also the section on culture, it really shows the significance, and the conclusion, the last few pages seems like it summarizes a lot of the real significant stuff.
Yeah, and there's a lot more on the culture in here, but part of the reason is because there are just more sources for the Kingdom of Sicily than there is for the Duchy of Apulia that Robert Guiscard put together. But I really urge you to read this book, especially before the final exam. Hint, hint. So this is a really marvelous book, and this is the subject we're going to take up tonight. Obviously, I can't cover everything in the book. There's so much more in the book than we're actually going to talk about tonight, but I invite you to ask questions and make comments as we go along. Yeah.
This is not related so much to the book as to the final. On the webpage, it mentions that the final exam will be in a different format, but are we taking the final exam sort of like we took the midterm, or are we actually showing up for a final exam period?
You actually come in for a final exam. It's required by the university that everybody be on campus in a room for the final exam. Yeah, memorize all the books. And the final exam will be quite different from the midterm.
Will it be comprehensive or just on the second half?
It will be comprehensive. And because, and this is a good time to talk about it 2 weeks before the class ends, because we have so many things to compare about the Normans in England and the Normans in Italy and Sicily. A hint for the final, you know, that we want to compare what the Normans did in the different places. Yeah.
And one more question. Is this going to be, can you give us a hint about the format? Is this going to be like the multiple choice kind or the essay writing kind?
I never, ever, ever give a multiple choice test. It's an essay. It will be an essay, for sure. There might be a map test. I'll decide. I'll let you know. Well, you know, maps are important. We're doing map things. Okay, let's take a look at Roger and what he was doing. And here is that famous picture of Roger II, and of course he's being crowned by God, not by the Pope, And so this is a hint at how he viewed himself and how he thought of himself. Let me just kind of zoom in on that. That's not too bad. It was very, very dark in the church that day when I took that picture. But you can see Roger is being crowned by God. And so this hints about his theory of government and his theology. The Pope is utterly left out of this viewpoint. Okay, this mosaic is in the Church of the Martorana in Palermo. In the Church of the Martorana in Palermo, and I'll be showing you that church later next time, not this time. Well, let's see. Okay, in 1102, in January, Roger the Great Count died, and he was succeeded by his young son Simon. You remember that we talked about Roger the Great and how he had this handicap of having mostly female children, and then with only at his third, and then his only son died, and then only in his third marriage did he have young children. And so when he died, the children were very young. Simon was the oldest boy, and he was age 7. Adelaide, his mother, was regent, but Simon was very sickly, and so he died within 3 years. There are very few sources on this period, and we really don't know very much about Simon. So in 1105, Simon died, and Roger, his next younger brother, succeeded at the age of 6 this time. Again, Adelaide was the regent, and she was Count Roger's third wife. She was not an illustrious woman in her own right. She was the daughter of an obscure baron in the north of Italy. And she really didn't have a lot of family to draw on, and she also was not very interested in Italy. She had spent most of her time in Sicily, and she had not really had a lot of contact with the Italian barons. And so she really focused most of her attention on Sicily. Meanwhile, in Italy, Roger II inherited Calabria as well as Sicily, but in Italy, Roger Borsa's son, Duke William, ruled the rest from 1111 to 1127. Now, at this point, we have another historian who takes up the story, and he takes up the story of his great hero, Roger II, a heroic figure worthy of a romantic history that he's going to tell. And so he really is telling the deeds of Roger in the heroic mode that we saw in England and that we saw in Italy of Robert Guiscard. If the Normans in Italy yearned for a kingdom, it was not apparent that there should be one. There had never been a kingdom in southern Italy. Of course, the Roman Empire had been there, but that was a long, long time ago, and they weren't thinking very much about the Roman Empire. Italy was now separated from the rest of Europe and from the rest of the Mediterranean world, and nobody had ever even thought about unifying southern Italy into a kingdom, although northern Italy was thought of as part of the German Empire. No kingdom had ever existed, and of course Italy had been disunited under the Lombards and the Byzantines, and then the Normans came in. It was really fragmented, which is why you had so much trouble reading Graham Loud's book on Robert Guiscard. No kingdom had ever existed in Sicily. It had been part of the Roman Empire. It had been a part of the Muslim world, but the Muslim emirs had divided it up, and mostly the major cities of Sicily had belonged to the different emirs, and they had fought among themselves, and nobody thought of unifying it. But Roger I had married 2 of his daughters to kings. Maximilla, he married off to Conrad, king of Italy. This would have been a kingdom in northern Italy, who died around 1101. And one of his daughters, whose name we don't know, he married to Coleman, king of Hungary, who died in 1116. So whenever the daughters of a great man are marrying kings, you can see that they're having royal ambitions. And so he had great ambitions for himself and for his children. He planned the marriage of a third daughter to King Philip of France, It's quite incredible. He had too many daughters, but I counted them up in the genealogy that we had in our Roger II book, and he had 18 children, so he was very prolific as far as all the children that he had. Well, Alexander of Toulouse saw the hand of God guiding Roger II to kingship, and of course this was after the fact. You know, looking back, he thought, well, of course he should have been king, and he has a right to be king. It's like writing history and projecting the present onto the past and making up a story to predict what's going on. And you have, there's a dream recounted by Hubert Holbein that predicts him being a great king, of the tree blooming on the hillock, and he climbs up this ladder, and he's seated on a throne and rules everybody around him. In fact, Alexander of Toulouse reported falsely that Sicily had formerly been a kingdom, and so he's trying to find every justification that he can for Roger being king. And here is the beautiful kingdom of Sicily, or the beautiful land of Sicily. This is the coastline of Sicily that Adelaide and Roger would have been familiar with, where he was raised as a child, and where he was most at home. But Roger had to wage a continuous and perilous fight for survival. One key to his success was his Saracen mercenaries. He raised far more than his father had, and on Roger the Great Count's death, I wonder if I skipped a page. Hold on a minute. Did I skip it? Nope, I didn't skip a page. Okay. Roger had to wage a continuous and perilous fight for survival, and one key to his success was his Saracen mercenaries. He raised far more Muslim troops than his father, Roger the Great, ever had. On Roger the Great Count's death, Italy broke down into chaotic warfare. He had been the strong man who held it all together, and once he was dead, all the independent barons with ambitions to rule their independent cities just broke out. Many magnates started acting independently, and part of the problem was there's a child. Roger II was only 6 years old, and a woman was ruling, Adelaide. Some of the magnates in Italy appeared to be looking toward Constantinople rather than Italy. They looked for a reconstitution of the imperial power from Byzantium to take over again. Adelaide actually proved to be a very good regent. She's reported to have, quote, scattered her enemies like chaff before the wind, and she actually bridged the gap between the constructive Sicilian rule of Roger I and the accession of her son Roger II. And we also have to note that if Roger I had not built a rather strong bureaucracy and a rather strong government, she couldn't have done that. She was able to hold Sicily together and rather miraculously hold her own against the barons of Italy as well. Excuse me. Everything's sticking together here. Okay, and here is Italy. Here is the rebellious area of Italy. This happens to be Ravello on the Amalfi Coast, a very beautiful area. And this is Philip I of France, to whose daughter Roger I had ambitions. Roger I had ambitions to marry his daughter to a son of Philip I. Okay. Roger I had established notable ministers, largely Greeks, at his court. Prominent was Eugenius, who was later archon or mayor and emir. He was bond, syndic, or protonotary. Nicholas of Mesa was a chamberlain, and the most important courtier who held things together was Christodoulos. The prelates, he was clearly a Greek. The prelates helping Adelaide were appointed by Roger I, Robert, Bishop of Messina, Roger, Bishop of Syracuse, who was a Norman, Gerland, Bishop of Agrigento, who was a Frenchman, Ansher, a Breton in the Norman Abbey of St. Euphemia in Calabria. Adelaide herself issued numerous charters in her regency as Adelaide the Countess. And so there was a strong group of men who could help and support Adelaide as she held everything together at this time period. Here is a picture of one of these bishops. This is the bishop donating his church. In this case, this is from the Church of the Martirana in Palermo, and the bishop is donating the church to the Virgin. As you can see, he's prostrating himself, and that's quite interesting because this business of prostrating yourself on the ground and sort of crawling to the person you are venerating is a Byzantine characteristic, and it's also done in the Muslim kingdoms to the rulers. And so we're seeing again changes in the culture that are changing the way the Normans act here. So here he is donating his church to the Virgin, and she's got a foundation charter. Can you see that? Maybe I'll zoom in on that foundation charter and focus it. What language is it written in? Greek. Yeah, Greek. And the inscription below it is written in Greek as well. This is characteristic of all the churches in Sicily, that you see all three languages used rather indiscriminately, Greek and Latin and Arabic, in all of the different inscriptions. And so here is a church that is focusing on purely on the Greek language. Okay. And this is one of the churches that was built around this time. This church is a little bit later, but I'm showing it here to kind of show you what kind of churches the Normans are building. This is the earliest church of the most famous churches in Sicily that was built by the Normans. This is Cefalù. And I guess I didn't write that down anywhere. You need to know how to spell that. Okay. This church is called Cefalù, and it's in the town of Cefalù on the coast of Sicily, the northern coast between Messina and Palermo. As you're driving along that coast, that's where you come to this little city, and I'll show you some pictures of what Cefalù looks like a little bit later. I've already shown you one when I showed you the coast of Sicily, but this is the church of Cefalù, and as you look at it, it looks very much like the churches that were being built in Italy at that time, doesn't it? It has the two twin towers, and it has the front with three doorways, a very high staircase, and then this rather traditional, rather sort of archaic kind of early Christian form to it. And in fact, it is a rather archaic church, and like the early Christian churches. Here's the doorway as we go up into it, and you can see that it's earlier than a lot of the churches we've seen on the mainland already. It's very much plainer. We don't have that wonderful carving along the doorpost, and in fact we just have this tympanum that is quite simple, just a little bit of simple carving and no carving here. The bronze doors are very much simpler than the ones we've seen earlier in Italy. Here is the tympanum. And we might just kind of zoom in on that tympanum to get a better view of it. And focus it. You see the carvings are quite simple. Let's get in on the carvings. Not at all like the really elaborate carvings that we saw in the later churches in Italy. So this is one of the earliest churches that we're going to see in the whole course. All right. Yeah, question.
That facade appears to be out of replace the stone type of stone with the rest of the front. Is it possible that that entire facade was taken off some other church or temple or something in an ancient Roman or Greek or something and carted there for use?
No, I'm absolutely certain it was not. It's just a matter of the aging of it and the discoloration that you find with aging, because this church has been restored. When we look at the inside, we'll see some Baroque stuff added to the walls, but we'll see the interior is very typical of the earliest churches that we saw in Italy. So this dates from a very early time. Do we have a question?
It looks like we've got more of a groined arch or groin vaults on either side. Am I correct or incorrect?
Yes, these are groin vaults. You have an open mic there. Be sure to take your hand off the mic while I'm talking, okay, because we get an echo. All right? Those are groin vaults, but they're wooden groin vaults. They're almost decorative. We know for sure that the idea for groin vaults came from the pointed arches that Europeans found among the Muslim lands, and it's quite likely that Sicily was the place they found them rather than the Holy Land. And so here is a case where they've constructed groin vaults out of wood. This may well be a presaging, a foretelling of the later groin vaults in stone. Because I believe, and we'll see the inside of this church, as I recall, it has a wooden roof, which is a Roman wooden roof, so it predates groin vaulting. So you see, this is like a kind of foretelling of that. Yeah, question?
Is this actually built in the Norman times, or are they taking over Byzantine churches that were used by the Muslims as mosques and then reconverted?
No, this was clearly built in the Norman times. Everything about it is new and Norman. Nothing like it was there in the other churches. So this has to be a new one. Here is the interior, and as I said, it's got a wooden roof in the tradition of the Romans. We can't get that whole thing in there, so you can see the roof and what the roof is like. Okay, focus it a little bit, and now I'm going to move it down so you can see the walls. Okay, it's got some interesting things. It's got pointed arches, and they're horseshoe arches, which is clearly Muslim in origin. But look at the walls. They're very plain and simple. There might have been frescoes on it, or maybe not. It might have been just plain. But remember our church at St. Angelo in Formis that had frescoes all over the walls. These walls are plain, and here they're brick. They're Norman brick. But there's a magnificent Byzantine mosaic in the apse here in this altar area. And we're going to take a look at that in just a moment. Here is another view of that interior that you can see. You can see the arches a little better. They're clearly horseshoe arches, and the columns are very Roman in character. The very plain walls, these are the plain Norman walls that we saw in churches elsewhere. This is the only place where there are mosaics. Here are those plain walls again with a column that's very Roman in inspiration. There you can see those arches a little more closely. Here is the ceiling that you can see a little bit more clearly. And here is, and I want to stop and look at this a moment, here is the Norman. This is all added later. This is Baroque that's added later. The Norman part is right here in the apse, and all of these Byzantine mosaics are Norman, that come from the Norman time, and I'm going to zoom in on that. The colors are magnificent. I'll try to focus it a little better. There we go. Yes, this is a typical Byzantine representation. It's called Christ Pantocrator, Christ the ruler of the world. And this is in all the Byzantine churches. Yeah, question?
What's the source of that light? Is that from outside, or is that lighted from the back?
No, it's from outside. It's not lit from the back. The windows. It was a bright and sunny day that day that I was there, and it was about noon, and I had 15 minutes in the church before they closed for lunch. And when they closed for lunch in Italy, they closed for 3 hours. So I took my pictures really fast. Okay, let me see if I can zoom in on that even more and kind of focus it so you can see. But oh, it's getting a little blurry. But you can see this is the very typical picture that is going to be over the apse and with an open book, and we can't see the language that's written in that Bible. The book of law. This would be the book of law. We can move down and we can see the angels that are standing under him, and maybe we can get a little bit of that mosaic. I'm afraid we can't get too much of it. The altar was roped off, and so I couldn't get close enough to really get these pictures well. But they're mosaics, they're not paintings. They're very magnificent little tiles that are glued in together to make a picture, and maybe we'll move up. Now this is a little better. We can see the angels here in the decorations, but this is the typical kind of mosaics that we're now going to see in all the Norman churches. This one is the first one. It's very simple and not very elaborate, but it has the basic image that we want to see. And there we can see it's just in the apse. This is the apse over the altar. And so Christ Pantocrator is over the altar. All right, here is a column, and we can see the roof and those horseshoe arches again. Focus that. Okay. And here is, this is actually the door that you go in and out from the back, and these are the bronze doors that you go in and out of, and very plain, very simple, very Norman. And here is the tower that we've seen, this Norman tower over and over again. It's a clear Norman tower, very typically Norman tower. But notice once again, this is in the front. We've got Roman columns with Roman capitals, and we've got Muslim pointed arches. And this church is beginning to show the synthesis that's going on between the Greek, the Norman, and the Muslim culture, and it's under the Normans that all of these cultures blend together into a richer and newer Sicilian culture. Simon and Roger, and later Roger alone, witnessed the charters of Adelaide along with her. So she raised up her little sons and educated them as she governed the country. She took them with her and she showed them how to do things. She gave them a very good education. And if you recall, when we talked about the Normans in Normandy, that was exactly the way the Normans in Normandy raised their children. The fathers took their children with them, and they all signed the documents together, carrying out the laws and the grants and the business of the realm. So the children were taught at a very young age. Adelaide's interest centered on Sicily, and Mileto, Roger I's capital in Italy, declined in prominence. Messina was her principal residence, and she probably chose it because Messina was a Greek city and mostly Greeks lived there, and so she felt more comfortable. Palermo itself and many of the other cities were very Muslim in character, so these would have been more difficult for her to adapt to. Yeah.
It's also right there on the Straits of Messina, so in a sense she could keep up an involvement over in Calabria without too much trouble, instead of being 100 or 200 miles away in Palermo, out of sight, out of mind. Instead, she's right there.
That's an excellent point. That does make it easier for her to try to control Calabria, and certainly Italy was out of control at this time during the children's minority. I mean, it really fell apart. Yeah.
Also, majority of the Christians lived on the east in the northeast. So Palermo would have been a very large place, and Roger does seem to go there very early at 16. So he does get into the midst of that very large city.
Yeah, and Roger did go there early in his career, but of course his father, Roger I, had made his headquarters in Palermo, and so from a very early time. I believe, I just happen to recall the date of Cefalù. I believe it's 1130. So that would have been a church actually built by Roger just when he became king, the church I just showed you, but I should have showed it later, but it seemed better to show it here. Anyway, Roger was involved, but his father had been too. And Palermo was the biggest city in all of Sicily. It was a vibrant metropolis and a trading center and the obvious center of governance in Sicily. So even though Adelaide preferred Messina, it was clear that if Roger was going to be a good ruler, he would move to Palermo, and he did. In 1106, when the Emperor Henry IV died in Germany, he was succeeded by his son, the Emperor Henry V, and very shortly, Henry V invaded Italy again, moving against the Reformed papacy, and Pope Paschal II, the Reformed Pope, was imprisoned. This war between the Reformed popes and the German emperors went on for about 100 years before it was settled, and it's constantly going on, and the Italians and Sicilians, the Normans, are right in the middle of all of these controversies. So as the papal and imperial politics fluctuated, the Norman politics in Sicily fluctuated as well. In 1111, Roger Borsa, the Duke of Apulia, died, and he was succeeded by his son William, a strong Duke of Apulia. And so, in 1111 to 1117, you have civil war in Apulia. Whenever one of the rulers die, all the barons rebel and break out against them, and war breaks out. Both the heirs of Roger Borsa and of Bohemond were minors, and their mothers were Elaine of Flanders and Constance of France were regents, and so you had women ruling virtually everything with Adelaide in Sicily, and the barons took advantage to try to promote their own independence at this time. So you have children as the nominal rulers, and women as the rulers of record at this time. Constance was the daughter of the King of France. She was the daughter of Philip of France, by the way. Elaine was the daughter of the Count of Flanders. So these were very eminent women. This is the Emperor Henry IV, as he's shown in his documents. And he died, and so the ruler became Henry V, and this is Henry V as shown on his seal, and let me just zoom in on that so you can see it a little better. Henry V as a portrait of him on his seal. Okay. Neither of these women regents in Italy could control the barons. They just simply were not able to, and Norman Apulia lapsed into constant warfare. Constance, as we said, was a daughter of King Philip of France, and she was imprisoned by an upstart guy who seized Bari, and so this is typical of what was going on all over Italy, utter chaos. Many of the barons turned to the papal party's idea of putting the West under the son of the Byzantine emperor. I mean, they were even willing to bring the Byzantine emperor back and have his son be the nominal ruler of southern Italy. Once he was released, Paschal II tried to restore peace as best he could. And it was under these conditions that Roger of Sicily came of age in 1112 at the age of 17. Or he could have been 16. Different authors vary in the different dates that they pick. he appears with Adelaide in a benefaction to Palermo as Roger iam miles iam comes, which means now he's a knight and now he's count. So this suggests that he has come of age and he's taken over the rule from his mother Adelaide. Immediately he held a great court at Palermo, and now Mileto and Messina were eclipsed. And as I said, even he was a very bright guy, and he knew that Palermo had to be the center of his realm at this point. Yeah.
What's the difference between the titles count and duke?
Oh, that's a good question. Okay. A count or a comes is a regional ruler of a region like a county of France. Let's take France as an example, which is divided into counties. In the main region, especially in the central part of France, it's divided into counties. But along the edges, on the military frontiers, it's divided into duchies. And the dukes who rule are called duces. The Latin word is comes for count, and it means companion. It goes back all to the earliest time in Germanic history. A comes is a companion to the king, like the Germanic bodyguard that would be at the king's table and living with him. A duces, whoops, or, I'm sorry, that's the plural, dukes. Is the duke's name in Latin. He's a military commander. And so the marcher areas on the fringes, on the borders where they're enemies, are ruled by dukes who are military rulers. The comes is more of a political ruler who is an underling to the king. And he would be a vassal. No, the duke is superior to the count. The duke is regarded as stronger and more powerful than the count. Yeah, question. Just press your mic.
I may have just missed it in my writing, but what does miles stand for?
Miles means knight or soldier. Knight, yeah. So miles and comes. So a count is less important than a duke, okay? But Roger was count, and that was good enough for him at the age of 16 or 17. He held his great court at Palermo. Messina was largely Greek, and Palermo was largely Muslim, the greatest metropolis in all of Italy and Sicily. I mean, far greater than Bari in Italy, and so this was the place to be. Okay, let's locate our places on the map. Here is Mileto, which is in the center of Calabria, which is where he would rule Calabria. Messina is right across the straits, as we pointed out. And here's Cefalù, which is along the coast as we go along here. And here is Palermo right here, right on the coast. And a magnificent port in a magnificent bay. In a perfect position in the middle of the Mediterranean to be a center of trade everywhere. Yeah.
Does Syracuse have any importance at this time?
Yes, Syracuse is a major city, and it's a Greek city, although it was ruled by, from time to time it's ruled by emirs, but nevertheless it's Greek. It was ruled by a Muslim family at this time, though.
I'm wondering, being in the north is pretty important to be away from the coast that's directly facing the Muslims. So the position of Palermo is better than to be at Syracuse at this time.
I think so, because it links up with the African trade and also with the Spanish trade, because of course the Muslims are in Spain at this time, and then there's trade growing with southern France. Southern France has some very important cities at this time. Pisa in the north, in Italy as well, yeah. And so we're seeing, but the whole economy is picking up all over Europe, and so Palermo is positioned to become the greatest of the cities at this time. And whether Roger saw it or not, it's hard to tell, but he certainly developed it well. Roger began to hold courts in Palermo, Mileto, and Messina, but clearly he favored Palermo. Now, something really strange happened, quite bizarre in fact. In 1113, Adelaide married Baldwin I, king of Jerusalem. And Baldwin I was actually the son of Eustace of Boulogne, who had ruled the county of Boulogne. And remember, Eustace had been important in the invasion of England. He had been one of the major supporters of William the Conqueror. Yeah. And so Baldwin had gone on the First Crusade, and he was the third son. He was the third youngest son, and distinguished himself. He was very shrewd and very smart and very well educated, and became king of Jerusalem in the end. To sort of make a long story short, his brother actually had been chosen the first king of Jerusalem, and now I'm forgetting his name. I can't believe that I'm forgetting his name. But anyway, Baldwin, when his brother died in just a year, Baldwin became king, and he was by a subterfuge, and he was a very good ruler of Jerusalem, but he was unlucky with his marriages. He had 2 marriages, and one of his wives died, and the other one he put aside because she had no children. And so, but Jerusalem was very poor. Jerusalem was very poverty-stricken. It was difficult to collect taxes, and it was such a difficult country to rule. And so he needed money desperately, and here was Adelaide, the Queen of Sicily, which was probably the richest kingdom in Europe at this time. It was just rolling in money. It had so much wealth. So Baldwin sought Adelaide for the rich dowry she would bring. He had already been married twice but had no children, and Adelaide herself seems to have coveted a royal title. Whatever the reasons, both of them were very political in their actions, very political, but she accepted Baldwin's offer on one condition, that if they had no children, Jerusalem would pass to Roger of Sicily. And so she was going to win for her son a kingdom one way or another. Some people suspect she already knew she couldn't have any children, and she was going to trick Baldwin, but Baldwin could not be tricked. And she was very smart. She got this provision in writing that the kingdom was to pass to her own son if there were no children from the marriage. Well, Baldwin's envoys accepted this term on an oath. They actually swore on a stack of Bibles and relics that they would obey this. And once they all got back to Jerusalem, they renewed these oaths in the presence of the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Arnulf, and the chief men of the realm. And everybody swore to Adelaide that her son would inherit if there were no children. There were no children, and so the marriage proved sterile and unhappy, and as soon as he had his hands on all the money from her dowry, he repudiated her. And he did this through manipulating the church system and going through the popes. So Baldwin repudiated her, sent her home without her money, and she ended up retiring to a nunnery where she died shortly thereafter. Yeah, question?
I find this all amusing because when you go back a few centuries to when, all these Normans and what have you had been in Scandinavia, I believe if the wife were put aside, she got her dowry back.
Yes, that's true in Scandinavia, but it's not true in European law. Women are not don't have as many rights in Europe as they did in Scandinavia.
I just find the difference interesting because the women still seem to be no less strong in their own way.
Yes, but these women are very strong, and Adelaide certainly was. I mean, she had a lot to gain, but I think that Baldwin always had the loophole that his second wife was still living. And he knew he could go back to the papacy and he could get them to rule in his favor if he wanted a divorce, and which is probably why he swore on a stack of Bibles that he would honor his oath to Adelaide. Yeah, did you have a comment?
Yeah, that's what the author of this book talks about, that Baldwin's marriage had not been dissolved, and so that's why, or his ministers were actually the ones that reneged and wanted to use this way of getting out of the marriage, or
Yes, but isn't that always what happens when the king makes a mistake? The underlings are blamed for it. I mean, somebody's got to take the blame, and the king is not going to take the blame. I won't mention the current political situation at this point. But that's what the records say, that the ministers wanted to do it. And, you know, blame it on your advisors. That's what kings and counts do. So Baldwin repudiated her. I think Baldwin was too smart and too shrewd and too powerful not to have been behind it himself. I mean, I think Baldwin, everything I've read about Baldwin, he was quite capable of that kind of manipulation. He got the money. He kept it. He kept the dowry. Yeah. And here is Sicily, the beautiful land to which she returned. And, you know, I don't know whether it was because it was springtime and when I was there and taking these pictures, but all over Italy and Sicily there's this beautiful kind of hazy haze, this kind of fog that's there constantly. It gives you a feeling of a fantasy or almost unreality in this beautiful land. It's like San Francisco, well, and the climate is like San Francisco. It was chilly there. It wasn't really hot, although it would warm up in the afternoons. But it's like a Mediterranean climate. That's what it, I mean, it's classic Mediterranean climate. It's in the Mediterranean. And here is a view. This is Cefalù. This is, again, I showed you the coast of Cefalù from the bay, and here is the city of Cefalù, built all along the coastline with these fishing boats, of course, going in. This is a Norman drainage area right here. It's a Norman arch, and these are Norman arches.
That just looks like a flooding.
No, it's a bay. This is a little bay, an inlet to a bay. And the water, yes, you could see right to the bottom of the bay. It was very beautiful and very clear, and the fish were just wonderful, wonderful. The comment was not like the Gulf of Mexico. But you can see these sheer cliffs arising, and it's very much like Italy. Remember that we talked about Italy having these sheer cliffs that go right down to the sea, and the mountains that practically go straight up. Sicily is exactly like that. The geography is very much the same. And here is the map showing the way to Jerusalem. Oh, I'm sorry, Jerusalem is not on this map. Okay, yeah, but here it would be Jerusalem just south of this area right here where she would have gone, and not very far back to Sicily to come home at this point. Okay, Arnulf is the Patriarch of Jerusalem. He obtained from Pope Paschal II instructions to pronounce the marriage invalid on the grounds that Baldwin's second wife was still living. And so, you know, Baldwin knew that she was living. Baldwin was too smart not to know what the law was. Yeah, comment.
This is about the map. I just had a quick question. You know, just from the map, who at this point controlled Corsica and Sardinia?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know. Let's see. They could have been independent at this time, since so much was independent. Marseille in France eventually, Marseille and Barcelona eventually got control one after the other, spreading out into the Mediterranean because they were building trade networks. But at this particular time, I don't know. I'll see if I can find that out for you, but I don't know who did.
Sardinia was pretty important.
Yeah, Sardinia was, but Sardinia, you know, the geography of Sardinia and Corsica is just like Sicily. I mean, high, sheer mountains going down to the sea. And even today, it's pretty wild and woolly there.
Maybe it was in the Spanish orbit.
It could have been in the Spanish orbit because there's a big trade network with Spain. Also, though, Marseille in France was building a big trading area in that area. Yeah.
Yeah, but not at that time. Almost all of Spain was under the control of Al-Mansur, the Caliphate of Cordoba.
At this particular time, about half of Spain had been reconquered by the state in the 1130s. And so there was a steady movement pushing the Muslims southward in Spain. And they had reconquered about half of it. Toledo fell in 1085, and Toledo is exactly in the center of Spain. So they had pushed down, the Christians had pushed down over half of Spain at this time, and they were steadily pushing the Muslims out. Toledo is right here, right in the center, and so they were there it is. There's Toledo, and so the line, the Muslim line, is about here. And the Muslims are in the south. And also, the other thing about the Muslims in the south of Spain, just like in Sicily, they're all divided into little emirates. They're not unified. The Christian kingdoms are not unified either, but they're larger and they're stronger than the Muslims in the south. The Almoravids, I think, are ruling at this time, actually.
They unified, I think Morocco is where.
Yeah. The Almoravids were ruling in the south of Spain, and they were ruling across the north of Africa here. Okay. Now, in 1113, Pope Paschal II held a council in Soprano, which you remember where Soprano is. It's right in the middle of Calabria, down in southern Italy. And he invested young Duke William of Apulia with Apulia and Sicily. So Paschal was following a policy of divide and conquer. He was out to get Count Roger, and he didn't want, I mean, what he was trying to do was to make sure that Italy and Sicily were separate, that they were not unified, because that would have been a terrible threat to the papacy and the papal lands if Italy had been unified. In 1115, Paschal was at Troia, and he enjoined the Magnates to respect the truths of God there. So he was trying to spread his influence to the south of Italy and trying to get control of it. And young Duke William of Apulia was a very strong and shrewd politician, so he had picked him out to pit him against Roger of Sicily. In 1116, Adelaide returned to Sicily, divorced by the King of Jerusalem, and she retired to the convent of Patti near Tyndaris, and she died in 1118, not long afterward. But meanwhile, in 1117, King Henry V of Germany returned to Italy and expelled Paschal from Rome. So we have this political situation with the popes and the German emperors. Everybody's at war with everybody else, and it's a huge political struggle between all these different people. Paschal then took refuge with the Prince of Capua because William, Duke of Apulia, had proved to be ineffective after all, and the Prince of Capua seemed to be a little bit stronger. Nevertheless, he was happy to have divided rule in Italy. But in 1118, Paschal died, and Pope Gelasius II was elected. Robert, Prince of Capua, was emerging as the strongest man in Italy, and he escorted Gelasius to Rome. Duke William was getting weaker and less in control, and so Robert of Capua was emerging as the strongest one. But Roger of Capua and Salerno, Roger of Salerno is different from Robert of Capua. Roger of Salerno died in 1119, and at the very same time the Norman conquests in North Africa were beginning. And so in 1118, how long had Roger been Count of Sicily in 1118? How old would he have been then? Mid-20s, okay. He was already... Count Roger of Sicily, yeah. Born 1098, so he would have been about 21. about 21. And so he was already thinking about increasing his income and his rule, and so he was starting his conquests in North Africa. In 1121, Duke William of Apulia ceded Calabria to Roger of Sicily, so he was strengthening his muscles in the south of Italy as well. Before, William of Apulia had held part of Calabria. Now he gave it all to Roger, and he also named Roger as his heir. Roger had successfully extended his power into Italy, and William also gave up his remaining rights to Messina and Palermo. He did have some claims, because remember, when he was named Duke of Apulia, the Pope had also named him Count of Sicily. So at this time, he gave up those claims that the Pope had given him to Messina and Palermo. And so here we have, again, to remind us where everything is, here is Capua and Salerno, Apulia is over here, and Calabria is down here. Cosenza is here, and this is as far south as the Pope had gone. Okay. In 1122, at the Concordat of Worms, peace was made between Pope Gelasius and Henry V. Okay, at this point, this was the end of what has been called the investiture contest, and we saw the investiture contest going on in England. Remember, it was between Pope Paschal II and King Henry I over the right of the king to receive homage from his prelates and to give investiture to the bishops and the archbishops. That had been all settled in England in 1106. But the battle still went on between the Roman emperor and the popes, and now Pope Gelasius actually made the very same settlement that Henry I had made with Paschal at the Concordat of Worms in 1122. Essentially what happened was the king retained the rights to receive the homage of his bishops, but he gave up the right to invest them with their bishoprics. And so it's a compromise. That happened, and so this happened in 1122. This meant that the wars between the popes and the emperors were cooling down. And at this very point, Roger began more of his raids on Africa, specifically in Mahdia, and we'll trace that conquest of Africa out a little bit later. In 1125, Henry V died, and we have a new emperor in Germany. Lothar was elected emperor. And at this point, Roger took Malta, which is a stepping stone to Africa, an island just south of Sicily. In that same year, though, William of Apulia died without an heir, and according to what we saw before, Roger had been named the heir of William of Apulia, and so Pope Honorius II was very much upset, and what he did was make an alliance with Jordan of Capua to oppose Roger's inheritance. And so the death of William of Apulia raised an Italian-wide crisis. Everything was in crisis, and who was going to inherit. And once again, when somebody dies, everything's up for grabs, and everybody tries to grab it. Yeah, no comment? Okay, comment?
Was Jordan Richard Aversa's son?
Yes, Jordan was Richard of Aversa's son. The names run in family lines, so it's another Jordan. I believe this is Jordan II. Okay, if I can keep them all straight. Because Richard of Aversa was variously called Richard of Aversa or Richard of Capua. He could be called both because Aversa and Capua were right next to each other. If we want to look at our map again. I'm not sure. Now, they're right next to each other. They're almost side by side with each other, and they're both little tiny Italian towns. And they were little tiny towns at that time too, but they're right next to each other. They're so close that you can see why both of them, I mean, either one of the names could go with the count, but here they are right here. The big town is actually Amalfi on the coast, and Salerno is a huge town. Naples, of course, is very huge too, and it was in those days, because the coastal towns were the trading centers. And these were feudal centers inland, that were more concerned with farmland and agricultural land. Yeah.
It seems like Salerno, Bari, and Palermo would be comparable in importance.
I would say Bari and Palermo, but Palermo was bigger by far than any city in Italy, except Rome, maybe. Yeah. Okay. Okay, and with the death of William of Apulia, then there was an Italian-wide crisis, and Count Roger seized the opportunity. And at this point, he was about age 30, and he had spent his life educating himself and learning to be a very effective and shrewd ruler. And this was the point where he then took off, really, as we move up to 1130. Okay, this is the Cathedral of Worms, where the Concordat of Worms was signed. This is in Germany. And this is the new Emperor of Germany. This is the tomb of Lothar II, and I turned it upright so it looks like he's standing, but really he's lying on top of his tomb, but I wanted you to kind of see what Lothar looked like. And here is a coin portrait of Lothar that shows him on his coin, and maybe we can zoom in to see what he looks like here. Roger was scared of him? Yeah, he was a pretty ferocious guy. There he is as a king. And here are two, this looks like this is Christ and the Archbishop. Or it might be the Pope on this, the anti-Pope on this coin. It doesn't say here what it is, but here he is as the ruler on the front, and then this is the obverse. But these halos around their heads are suggesting possibly Christ and St. Peter, since they have halos around their heads, but they would symbolize the anti-Pope. Okay, let's zoom out. In 1127 to 1128, Roger of Sicily took all of his Saracen mercenaries and conquered Apulia. He had the support of Romuald of Salerno, and Salerno surrendered immediately. Amalfi followed, Melfi, Troia, and Montescaglioso also. And at this point, Roger was in command of everything, and Pope Honorius then excommunicated him, apparently for being successful and being a good conqueror. So, Honorius then organized a coalition led by Jordan II, Prince of Capua, and including Grimoald of Bari. Grimoald was this loose cannon. He was the guy who he was a commoner, and he just decided he was going to seize Bari. He's the one who threw Constance, the mother she was the mother of one of the heirs. I can't remember which one it is, but he threw her in prison, and when he seized Bari. And Tancred of Conversano, and if you recall, Conversano is just north of Bari, so it's a local kind of arrangement there. But Capua is over there in the midst of the headquarters of Apulia. But Jordan died in December 1127, and the whole campaign was conducted really with incompetence, and none of the allies could get along together, and so Roger had faced this very weak threat, and he was in command of all of Italy. Roger crossed to Italy in 1128 with a large mercenary army of Saracens, and Honorius was forced to withdraw that excommunication. And on the 22nd of April, Pope Honorius recognized Roger as Duke of Apulia and Overlord of Capua. And so Honorius had to concede that he recognized Roger. Yeah, question.
There had been a schism, though, that Roger supported the other pope and used that situation to pressurize the...
Yeah, well, I mean, that was constantly going on, switching back and forth and supporting the other pope. But once they captured Honorius, and Honorius was recognized as the rightful pope, and the other claimant to the throne was Anacletus, and he was looked at as someone who was unfavorable from the beginning. I mean, all the other countries had already recognized Honorius at this point. But Roger, tried to play both ends against the middle. Yeah, did you have a question? Mm-hmm.
It's just frustrating. It's just frustrating trying to keep all the Rogers and Roberts straight.
Right.
Somebody needed to just send back in time them like a new naming book or something.
Well, that's why we named him Roger the First and Roger the Second and Roger of Capua and Roger of Sicily, and so you have to keep them all straight in your mind. The Normans didn't have a large variety of names for their people, unfortunately. And also, these are royal names. There are certain names that are regarded as royal. And so if you name your child a royal name, you're sort of announcing your ambition for that child to grow up to be a king or a count or someone important. And so this is why if you name your daughter Matilda, you expect her to marry a king. And so this is what they were doing. Well, Honorius confirmed to Roger the homage of Robert, the new prince of Capua. Sorry, the same names again. Roger of Sicily did liege homage to Honorius. This means he did homage to Honorius as his liege lord or his top lord above all other lords. And he promised neither to invade Capua nor to allow anyone to disturb the papal rule of Benevento. And if you remember from last time, the popes had always claimed rule of Benevento. But Roger captured Brindisi, Siponto, Montalto, Troia, and finally Bari, all of those on the east coast in Apulia. And in 1129, Roger held a court of his feudal vassals at Melfi. He had now reconstituted the whole of Apulia as it had been under Robert Guiscard, and he had pulled it all back together. In 1130, a great feudal court outside Salerno demanded Roger as king by acclamation of the barons. Okay, this is very curious. Why did the barons all of a sudden decide that Roger should be king? It was in the air, or maybe it was Roger's idea, who knows? But there was a clamoring for Roger to be king, and what this smacks of is a kind of election, an election process that goes all the way back in German heritage to the earliest leaders of the Germans, the war leaders of Germanic peoples, and the Vikings as well, were elected by their followers. This was a custom that remained strong in Germany, and we're going to see later on that the emperor the families are going to change because elective kingship is practiced in Germany. So this is almost a mirror image of the elective kingship in the German Empire. Yeah.
Well, after all, if the Pope is elected by the College of Cardinals, why wouldn't the nobles elect the king?
They could, and it's a tradition that goes all the way back in Western history, in the history of Europe. Yeah, did you have a comment?
I'm wondering if Roger's at this time already thinking about promoting himself to be king.
I think he is. I mean, the chroniclers are saying Well, all the barons got together and they clamored and begged him to be king. I mean, it sounds like an election ceremony. Before the College of Cardinals was constituted to elect the Pope would always be kind of elected by the people of Rome, who would sort of clamor and acclaim him in the streets, and it was a kind of election. The archbishops of Canterbury in England were elected in the same way, by the magnates and by the people acclaiming them. And so it runs all over Europe. It's a very common tradition all over Europe. Yep.
But you do see in Roger, as he puts down those rebellions, that he is pretty harsh with them. So when he comes to Salerno, I'm sure the barons will comply. I mean, I don't think that they have a choice.
He was savage. He just carried out this savage and ruthless warfare and stomped them down so that they would never dare.
The archers let loose the Muslims.
Yes, but I don't think it was the Muslim troops that were so savage. I mean, I think it was their commander, because he didn't have to use them.
Chroniclers at some point give a pretty devastating picture of how they were going about it.
They do, and I have some quotes from those, and in just a second we might have time for them before the break. But here is Roger. Now, later, of course, this is after the fact, we see him again being crowned king, but they were clamoring for him to be king, and what do you know, it came true. Okay, there he is being crowned king. On the 27th of September, there's a bull of Pope Anacletus, the anti-pope, who recognized Roger as king. So he was recognized by the anti-pope. Honorius did not want him to be king, but Anacletus did. And 27 December, Roger was crowned as king of Palermo, and as he was now, I'm sorry, I've got a typo there, Roger was now ruler or suzerain of all the Norman lands in the south. He was now in a position to become king if he wished. But events were really determined in Rome, because on February 14th, Pope Honorius died and violent dissension broke out in Rome. There were two elections. A minority of the cardinals elected Gregory of Sant'Angelo as Innocent II, and a larger number of cardinals chose Peter, son of Perleone I, as Anacletus II. Both elections were grossly illegal, and at first it seemed as if Anacletus would prevail. But a lot of scurrilous propaganda was let loose against him, and in May, Innocent was forced to flee from Rome. He took refuge in France and received the support of Saint Bernard, and this was conclusive. Saint Bernard was the charismatic leader of all of Europe. And so Innocent then received much recognition in France and also in Germany. Henry I of England also accepted him. And Anacletus was only supported by Rome and Italy and the Normans. And it was under these conditions that he issued his famous bull conferring on Roger the title of king in September. And let me read you that bull just quickly before we take our break. This is what Anacletus said. We grant and confirm and sanction to you and to your heirs the crown of the kingdom of Sicily and Calabria and Apulia, and of all the lands which we and our predecessors have granted to your predecessors, the Dukes of Apulia, namely Robert Guiscard and Robert his son. This kingdom is to be held by you in perpetuity and ruled by you always with all regal honors and all royal rights. We appoint Sicily as head of your kingdom. Further, we sanction and grant that you and your heirs shall be anointed and crowned as kings by the hands of archbishops of your own kingdom and of your own choosing, and in the presence of such bishops as you may wish. And we give and sanction to you and your heirs the principality of Capua and the honor of Naples and the support of the men of Benevento. And a lot of historians today think that Roger actually wrote this papal bull giving him these rights. Yeah.
This goes further than Nicholas II's
Yes.
investiture.
It goes much further than Nicholas II's. I mean, he gives him complete control over the church and control over his own anointing and his own crowning by the archbishops, and he gets to choose who does it. In return, Roger was to give the Pope homage and fealty and an annual payment to Rome, plus a few other concessions. And here we have the coronation of Roger. And who does he choose as the one who crowns him? Well, he chooses God himself, the ultimate choice. And this takes the choice completely out of the hands of any pope. He's like a Byzantine ruler, yes. He is very much autonomous and with his own rights. Do you have a comment? Question? Well, we've reached the point where we've got him king now, so it's a very good time to take a break, and when we come back, we'll see how he begins to rule his kingdom and pull everything together politically to control this vast empire that he's created for himself. So about a 10-minute break.